Hello, I am Mrs. Arnold, and today we're learning about seawater. Main idea of this video is that oceans have distinct layers of water masses that are characterized by temperature and salinity. Essential questions are the following. What is the composition of seawater? What are the physical properties of seawater? And how is ocean layering illustrated? And how do deep water masses form? Chemical properties of seawater. So ocean water contains dissolved gases, and that will include carbon dioxide and oxygen. And it also contains dissolved nutrients like nitrates and phosphates. Levels of dissolved gases and nutrients in seawater vary by location and depth. So levels of oxygen and nutrients on this slide we're going to be looking at silica in particular vary by location and depth. So if we look at these slides, we see the depth in meters on the y-axis. Along the x-axis, we can see how much oxygen is in the water. And it's the same for the silica. Silica is going to be used by animals to make their shells. So what we see with oxygen is going to be higher at at higher depths. So higher at the surface. So oxygen is higher at the surface and it decreases as we go down. So right here, we see that oxygen is at like 200. And then as we go down, we can see that oxygen is going to decrease. And you can also see this is the North Pacific and this is the North Atlantic. And you can see that the concentration of oxygen in these two parts of the ocean vary. Okay. Why is oxygen higher at the surface? So oxygen is going to be higher at the surface due to photosynthetic organisms. And I've spelled that wrong. Photosynthetic organisms. So they are using the sun's energy to create oxygen. So that is why that's higher. Now, silica is one of the nutrients you're looking at, and organisms, like I mentioned earlier, use it to make shells. And you can see that the levels of silica, as we go down in depth, what it does is increase, particularly in the North Pacific. So the reason why it does that is because when organisms die, they sink. So silica increases as you go down in the ocean because decaying organisms sink. So decaying organisms sink, and so therefore silica is higher at bottom. Factors that influence substances in the ocean are wave action, the vertical movement of water, and biological activity. Salinity is a measure of the amount of dissolved salts in seawater. The unit here we use is grams of salt per kilogram of water, or parts per thousand. So that is how salinity is going to be expressed. The most abundant salt in the ocean is going to be sodium chloride. And we also have other salts of chlorides and sulfates that are made from magnesium. So I'm just going to write salts of chlorides in sulfates made of magnesium, potassium, and calcium. So as this chart shows, or this picture shows, is salt is going to vary by location, but the average salinity, on average, the average salinity of the ocean is 35 parts per thousand. But remember, that's the average. The actual salinity is going to vary from place to place. You see right here, we have 34 in the Pacific, but here, right near the east coast of South America, it's 37. So other places where we can see variations in salinity, generally you're going to find higher salt content in the water in areas with high rates of evaporation. If you think about it, it makes sense. If the water that is containing the salt evaporates, it leaves behind the salt. The salt doesn't also evaporate. So that is why the salinity in the air is going to be higher, where there's a lot of evaporation. And you see low salinity in areas where large rivers empty into the oceans, creating areas of water called estuaries. This estuary is a place where sea and fresh water mix. Sea salt sources. So geologic evidence indicates that salinity of ancient seas were not that much different from the oceans of today. The sources of sea salts have also stayed the same over time, and we know this. So our evidence is looking at the proportion of magnesium in calcium carbonate shells of some marine organisms, and it's the same proportions then as it is now as it was back then. So other sources of sea salt is sulfur dioxide and chlorine, which are gases released by volcanoes. They dissolve in water and they form the sulfate and chlorine ions. Most of the other ions in seawater are going to be a result of weathering and also erosion of rocks. So the weathering of rocks further inland, and then the erosion of those rocks as they're carried by rivers down to the ocean. So iron and magnesium, for example, is going to come to the ocean that way. They're going to be weathered, and then they are going to enter rivers and transport to the ocean. Removal of sea salts in arid regions. The water evaporates from seawater and leaves solid salt behind. Marine organisms are also going to remove ions from the seawater to build their shells, bones, and teeth. Winds are also going to remove salt by picking up salty droplets from the breaking waves and depositing the salt further inland. And so the salinity of the water that we see is going to be a balance between the processes that remove the salts and the processes that add the salts. And so the next slide, well, I guess the slide after that probably. So this is just looking at evaporate formation. This is how salts can be removed. You can see here in this picture, that is the solid salt that was left behind from all the water that had evaporated, okay? And then this is just a reminder that biologic activity, like the organisms removing calcium ions from the water, is also going to result in the removal of salts in the sea. Okay, so as a review, what we just talked about the last few slides is the salt cycle in the ocean, and you can see the number of ways that salt is either added to the ocean or removed from the ocean. So we have our volcanic eruption right here that is adding salts to the ocean. So we can write that down. So volcanic eruptions add salts to the oceans. And also we have rivers that are carrying salts to the ocean. So we can add that we know that weathering is going on, and also erosion of rocks is going to carry salts to the ocean. Now, how is that salt removed from the ocean? So that salt can be removed from the ocean by the formation of evaporates. So basically we have evaporation of water. Let's see. And we have wind that carries salt inland. And we also have biological processes. So organisms using the salts for their body parts. Okay. We're going to talk about the physical properties of seawater, which are density, freezing point, and the absorption of light. So density is going to be influenced by the temperature and salt content of the water. So temperature-wise, cold water is more dense than warm water. So it is going to sink. And salt content-wise, sea water is denser than fresh water due to salt ions. So if you were to mix salt water and sea water together, salt water, if you were to mix salt water and fresh water together, you should get layers to form in your glass due to this. Okay. So also density of seawater ranges from about 1.02 grams per cubic centimeters to 1.03 grams per cubic centimeters. And the density of freshwater is 1 1.00 grams per cubic centimeter. The variations in salinity is also going to cause the freezing point of seawater to be somewhat lower than that of freshwater. So seawater, saltwater, is going to freeze at -2 degrees Celsius, while freshwater freezes at 0 degrees Celsius. The absorption of light. Water absorbs light, which leads to one physical property of seawater or water in general. So water absorbs light, which gives rise to another physical property of ocean, which is that they are very dark. Darkness. And if you look at this graph right here, in general, light is only going to be able to penetrate the first 100 meters of the ocean. And this is also where photosynthesis is able to occur. Okay. So in general, light penetrates only the upper 100 meters. Oceans have layers based upon their temperature and how salty they are. Average temperature of ocean water is 15 degrees Celsius, but the range is -2 degrees Celsius to 38 degrees Celsius, which you see near the equators. Obviously, as you go down, the temperatures are going to decrease. So ocean temperatures decrease as go down. And deep ocean water is always cold, even in the tropics. This figure is showing a typical ocean temperature profile, which plot the changing water temperature against the depth. These profiles are going to vary depending on the location in the season. So we can see that we have a surface layer, a thermocline, and a bottom layer. In our polar region, we can see that on the surface, it does not get very warm at all. But if you look over with our red tropical water, we can see that the surface layer is going to be fairly warm. You can also see how much it changes as how the temperature changes as you get deeper. So the ocean is divided into layers based upon its temperature. The surface layer is about 100 meters thick. It is warm and sunlit. This is going to not be seen at the poles, so absent at the poles. You don't see this here. The thermocline, this is the transitional layer. So these are what we name the layers when we're talking about them in terms of temperature. And in the thermocline, the temperatures decrease rapidly with depth. And it's also absent at the poles. And the bottom layer is cold and dark. And the temps are going to be near freezing. This layering is also caused by density. So remember, cold water sinks, so it is more dense. Deep water masses are the following: the Antarctic bottom water. I almost wrote water, and then I was like, let me make it just H2O, and then it looked weird. The North Atlantic deep water, and the Antarctic intermediate water. There we go, tick, intermediate water. So the water that is near the poles is very cold, and so that dense polar water is going to sink, and that is producing the deep water masses. And there are 3 deep water masses: the Antarctic bottom water, the North Atlantic deep water, and the Antarctic intermediate water. So this picture you can also see in your textbook. It just kind of describes how the dense cold water sinks. So deep water masses are, of the deep water masses, the 3 deep water masses, you can see the Antarctic bottom water is going to be the most dense in the coldest, and it's going to be overridden by the North Atlantic deep water and the Antarctic intermediate water. The Antarctic intermediate water is warmer and less dense, and thus it overrides the North Atlantic deep water in the Antarctic bottom water. So today we learned about the chemical and physical properties of ocean water. Particularly, we talked about salinity, density, and temperature. Have a wonderful day.